Today I'm fortunate to have Clive Shepherd with me, the author of the Blended Learning Cookbook and the New Learning Architect more recently. Thank you, Clive, for joining me. I was inspired by your new book, The New Learning Architect, Clive. What inspired you to write it?
Well, it's quite a while ago now, probably about 4 years, I think. And at that time, we were just beginning to hear quite a bit about informal learning. And I found that quite an imprecise and difficult term to get to come to terms with, because it didn't seem to describe all the things that you might consider as part of the way that you make learning and development happen in an organisation, over and above the very obvious formal courses that you run. So I started to make notes and try and work out what was for me a more satisfactory way of classifying everything that wasn't formal. And I started to feel I'd quite happy with the model that I developed, which separated learning that happens directly on the job, almost by accident in many cases, from learning that occurs on demand when you need something then and there, and you go hunting for information, from all those sorts of activities which are developmental but can't be classified as courses. And I also began to realise that all of these types of activities, which almost anybody who works for an organisation could identify with, could occur with the initiative coming from management, but it could also come with the initiative from the ordinary employee. And this started to sort of take shape as an idea, and I became quite excited by the idea of investigating that further and seeing whether it actually would make sense in terms of a really usable model. So that's what got me started, the model.
So how would you describe a learning architect?
Well, the idea of a learning architect came later to me. It wasn't part of the initial idea of the model that I was describing earlier. But it became obvious the further I investigated that if you were going to be scheming out all of these ways that you could make learning happen or encourage learning to happen for a particular audience, then that was over and above the role that you would normally encounter of someone working in learning and development. And in software, for example, they use the term a software architect, and obviously they have done for thousands of years in terms of architects of buildings. And I thought this is really what we're talking about. We're not designing environments for people to live in. We're designing environments, however abstract, that people can learn in. So that's where the concept of the learning architect arose.
Thanks very much, Clive. You mentioned in your book that those who just take orders are just like builders rather than learning architects. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
Well, that sort of distinction might sound a bit harsh, and I'm not trying to denigrate the work that people do in devising and putting on, often very excellent formal courses. Any more than I'd want to denigrate the work done by builders in making buildings. It's just that the role of an architect and a builder is very different. And I think that, unfortunately, many people currently working in learning and development in organisations are not really acting as architects. They're not looking at the big picture in terms of creating environments for learning at all. They're essentially carrying out instructions, which means that they're order takers. In other words, someone comes to them with a particular, not just with a problem, but they come to them often with a solution and say, I'd like you to build me a one-day course or an hour of e-learning. And they do a very good job, typically, of building those. But I don't regard that as professional an occupation, if you like, as the architect.
So why do you think that there might be more builders than architects in organisations these days?
That's a very good question, because obviously that's a pattern that's emerged not just in one type of organisation or in one part of the world. It's a very common occurrence, and I'm not sure that it's very easy to answer why that has arisen. But I think one of the reasons is that people working in learning development are often they have very definite expectations on them from their clients, and people associate them with the people that do the formal things, they run the formal courses. And that often all that learning that takes place outside formal courses, which we're constantly being reminded is at least 80% of everything that we learn, is not really recognised as learning by most people. They don't really realise that it's happening, even in many cases. So that's one of the problems. It's just not conceived, and the learning takes place outside the formal course, and the expectations are quite limited. But I also think that if you work in learning development, you don't necessarily have the power, or perhaps you just don't feel you've got the power to influence learning that takes place outside a classroom or outside of your particular learning space that you've got control over. Whereas in fact, I would contend that you have quite a big influence on learning that takes place in other settings, even though you can't control it fully. But who says you have to control it fully?
So what advice would you give for those who maybe want to challenge those orders?
I think it's difficult. You can't just expect someone to change their behaviour overnight, nor can you expect the environment in which they work to accept that change of behaviour. So however well-intentioned somebody is, they might find the culture of their organisation is quite hostile to that change. But I think that unless you are actually fortunate enough to be brought in as the head of learning development for an organisation, and you've got a sympathetic board above you which is prepared to support you and buys into your vision, then typically you've got to work on the periphery. But the concept of being a learning architect doesn't just work at the grand strategic level. It can work for a very small group of people. So you might just be an instructor for, I don't know, 50, 60, 100 people who work in, I don't know, maybe a customer service department or something like that. But that is an audience that you can start to think of as far more widely than in terms of what is the formal training they need. But you can think about how can they develop their skills and knowledge and become more effective in their performance in all sorts of different ways, and bit by bit you can start to influence that. So in other words, start small.
Thanks, Clive. Excellent advice. You touched on some recent research into the brain and how adults learn in your book. Why do you think that some learning and development teams may not have taken that on board?
Well, I think that in many cases, even if someone's had teacher training, it's quite possible that many teachers and trainers are actually not very well versed in even the long-standing learning theories, let alone the more recent developments. And in some cases, you could even say that the theory they have been given is very flimsy and perhaps even sort of pseudo-scientific. In many cases, people just use their instincts or follow good best practice models, which is fine, but they don't necessarily understand the theoretical underpinning of what they're doing. More dangerous is the fact that if you did get a particular good understanding at some stage in the past, that you haven't kept up to date with what's changed in more recently. Now, historically, most of the models that underlie teaching and learning come from psychology, where if you like, it's very hard, like with any social science, to come up with very, very hard evidence. And certainly it's very hard to understand the mechanics of why something should be true. One of the benefits over the last 20 years of the capabilities like doing MRI scans and so on the human brain is that people have been able to experiment much more completely in terms of finding out what actually happens in the brain to make learning happen. And it isn't necessarily that what's coming out of neuroscience actually is particularly contradictory of what we knew before or what we felt we knew before. Although sometimes it is, sometimes it is slightly different. But it's providing much more hard evidence. So I think in many cases, why aren't people taking it on board? It's because they just don't know it's happening. And I think that unfortunately not as many people as should undertake enough continuing professional development, as you would do in other professions. If you were an architect, for example, you would be expected to undertake continuing professional development and to keep up to date with developments in. If you're an architect, that would be with engineering, with new materials, with new ways of doing electrics and plumbing and what have you. You'd be having to keep up to date with those, because you'd soon be otherwise ineffective in your job. Well, I think a learning development professional has every bit of the same responsibility.
Excellent. Thanks for that explanation, Clive. Your book actually includes 4 contexts for learning. Can you explain a little bit more about your thoughts behind that?
Well, essentially, those 4 contexts are just my way of separating the different ways that people can learn. Not that real life is anything like as distinct as that. For me, it seemed that there were 4. It was helpful to distinguish between those 4 different categories. The obvious one of formal learning, I don't think anybody would have any quarrel with that, is just a question of something that can be categorized as a course. It's wrapped up with a curriculum, it has objective and assessment, it has some sort of formal tuition and formal materials and so on. We all understand what that is. But there's an awful lot of what I call, or in fact what often called in education in particular, non-formal activities as well, which fall outside the bounds of a course, but actually are quite common practice in organisations in terms of developing people for the future. So they have a future orientation, in other words, a developmental orientation. And that can be anything from learning on the job, coaching, all sorts of materials that organisations provide in terms of videos and websites and white papers and sending people to conferences and all those sorts of things, which are quite routinely part of the way we develop people for the future. So I think it was important that we are able to distinguish those. And we have to distinguish those from the third category, which is learning on demand, because that's a very different time context. Rather than, if you like, train to develop for the future, what you're doing is essentially saying, I've got a problem right now, I need to carry out a particular activity, and I don't know how to do it, so I need some immediate help. I mean, some people might say that's not even learning in many cases. What you're actually doing is getting information. Certainly you may never retain that, and you may never have any intention of retaining it, but nevertheless it's a very important part of the overall architecture that you provide the right resources, whether that's content or whether it's people, to support people for getting knowledge as and when they need it. The biggest category of all is probably that learning that is not, if you like, consciously proactive in any way. It's not something that you're deliberately doing, with learning in inverted commas as its primary aim, and that is actually reflecting back and learning from what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. What you might call experiential learning. Now, experiential learning happens whether you like it or not. It is just a natural part of living. That we soon learn that if something isn't working, that we adjust it. Even if we don't reflect upon it, we will change our behaviour almost automatically. But on the other hand, the more conscious effort you put into reflecting on your experiences and on the experiences of others that you observe, the quicker and the more powerfully you will learn from experience. And so that's a vital category in itself, experiential learning, which can actually be fostered and encouraged. You don't necessarily just have to leave it to happen by itself, but it's a very important fourth element.
You also took a look at these contexts from 2 different perspectives, your top-down and bottom-up, which you mentioned earlier on. Could you explain a little bit more about those?
Well, I think that the concept of informal learning became rather confused for me, as I was saying earlier. And one of the aspects of informal learning that is confused is the idea that informal learning is always a bottom-up activity. In other words, it comes from ordinary employees themselves. So they take it upon themselves to share knowledge with each other, or to reflect on their experience, perhaps with a blog, or they undertake some activity in a social network or whatever. But that is really just part of it, because a lot of those learning activities which are not a course are actually determined as part of the strategic management of learning development in an organisation. So pretty well all of the four categories that I mentioned, whether that's formal courses or it's all those sort of non-formal proactive ways of learning, or it's on-demand learning, or it's learning through experience, can be dictated, if that's the right word, or schemed out from above by management and made to happen because management wants to. It's very important for management that people are able to do their jobs properly, otherwise the organisation can't fulfil its objectives. But on the other hand, it's also true to say that employees within an organisation have a huge incentive to do their jobs well, not only so they can keep their existing job, not be fired, or be considered for promotion or recruitment to another firm, but because actually developing mastery, if you like, is one of the most motivating things that we can do. We love to become good at doing something. So there's a lot of incentive to make learning happen from the bottom up as well as the top down. And as I show in the model in the book, any one of those four categories that I mentioned earlier could be approached both from a top-down angle and from a bottom-up. The important thing is to recognise how to get that balance right in your particular organisation.
Excellent, thanks, Clive. So how do you expect this model to be used in organisations?
Well, I am one of those people who likes to create systems and models, but I'm not stupid enough to believe that that's how real life works. People don't typically sit down and scheme something out using the guidelines that have been laid out in some sort of formal training or in a book, but they can certainly influence your thinking. And what I would hope is that if somebody was really found the model useful for them while reading the book, is that they certainly consciously try and use that model to help them in looking at the strategy for learning for their particular population they're responsible for the next time they do it. Perhaps at least once try and look at that consciously. And probably if you find that useful and actually it helps you to scheme out your strategy formally, on subsequent occasions. But I have to be realistic and say that what you really hope is that some of the key insights that people might gain from the model that they can apply in a more free and imaginative way, just as an adaptation of their existing practice. Either way, I would be very pleased.
There's been a lot of talk lately about the 70-20-10 model. I'm just wondering how your model relates to it, if it does at all.
Yes, the 70-20-10 model, you are hearing a lot about that at the moment, and for anybody that hasn't heard of it, the idea is that 70% of what you learn is essentially experiential, which maps, of course, completely across to my model. 20% is essentially through social experiences, which cuts, in fact, across many aspects of the model that I lay out. And then the 10% is the formal, which, of course, is exactly the same as the formal in my model. I don't regard these as competitive models. What the 70-20-10 is essentially saying is recognising, is in a very generalised form that there's a lot more to learning than what takes place in the classroom or in any other sort of formal learning, and that experiential learning is very important. That has to be a very important statement to make. I would contest that you can say that 70-20-10 is actually applicable in every situation, because in some situations the formal element might be a lot higher or a lot lower, or the experiential or the social elements might be higher or lower. Nor do I think that you can actually use it as a prescription, because, again, every situation's different. There's an awful lot of difference working as a tele-sales operator, or a shop assistant, or a doctor, or a web designer, or a journalist, or whatever they are, or they're so different that I don't think you can generalise. So I find the 70-20-10 very helpful as a reminder of how important the non-formal and the experiential elements are. But I actually think that what you have to do for your particular audience could be very, very different from that.
So on-demand and experiential that you mentioned in your 4 contexts, to me could be thought of as informal learning, which you mentioned earlier on. What advice would you give to those who might be a bit sceptical about the role informal learning plays on an individual's performance?
I don't think anybody can be sceptical about the fact that informal learning happens. As I say in the book, informal learning is a very broad term, and in fact, it helps to be a bit more precise about than that, and to look at, I look at it in terms of non-formal learning and on-demand and experiential. But I think where there's a lot of skepticism is about what essentially somebody in learning development can do to in any way influence or control that. It's always happened, and I don't think anybody, if you ask them, would pretend that they hadn't learned a great deal outside what they'd learned from formal education or formal training. But I think a lot of people in learning development are quite sceptical, or to be honest, I think actually a little bit anxious about what their role might be beyond that, because that hasn't historically been the situation. But in fact, if you don't consider the less formal elements of learning, then you're never going to be comfortable that what you're doing is really going to work, because you might run a very good classroom course, or create a very good piece of e-learning, or write a very good book. But of course, the learning task is never going to be finished at the end of that course, or the end of someone reading that book. That's in many cases just a catalyst, and you can't. You feel that you've done your job properly, in my mind, if you haven't schemed out, at least in some way, how that's going to be followed on, and people are going to actually be able to put that into practice and improve their performance. So somehow or other, we've got to be more mindful of learning than just the formal elements.
Thanks, Clive. So what advice would you give to those who are wanting to try and measure informal learning then?
Well, it's always much harder to measure something that takes place outside a formal course, because you don't have control over all the elements. Obviously, in a course, you've got control over the curriculum, you've got control over the means of assessment. Although even then, we know that in fact everybody's going to come out of a particular formal event with a very different outcome in terms of learning, and they're going to make very different use of that. But nevertheless, at least that's a sort of reasonably controlled set of circumstances. And if you're going to evaluate anything in any strict form, then you need to be in control of all the variables that might determine the outcome. That's much, much harder to accomplish with anything that's not a formal course, because of the fact that lots of other issues impact on someone's performance over and above learning, like the motivation, or the clarity of their objectives, or the achievability of those objectives, or the way they're managed, or the tools that they have at their disposal, or the feedback they're given, and so on. So there are lots of other things get in the way. But I would say that we don't need to beat ourselves up about this, because in a way there is a very simple measure in the end of performance, and performance is really what we're interested in. Is you've only got to ask someone's manager whether somebody is doing their job as is needed, and you know that whether you've been successful or not. The fact that you can't unpick how much of that was essentially due to learning as opposed to some other factor, or how much of the learning was formal as opposed to informal, shouldn't discourage you from from taking some role in encouraging informal learning, as long as you are actually making an effort to measure performance, or at least measuring it indirectly by asking managers whether they feel that performance is up to scratch.
Thanks very much, Clive. Interesting explanation and advice there. Your book also includes 10 real-life learning architects. What were your thoughts behind including those examples?
Well, I think that if anybody has read one of my previous books, the Blended Learning Cookbook, they'd appreciate that I get quite anxious when the book becomes too theoretical or abstract. And in fact, in the cookbook, most of the book is taken up with examples. In other words, recipes for blended learning solutions. And I had the same feeling when I was creating the New Learning Architect book, is that this is all very well, but is perhaps coming over rather abstractly, and what really resonates with people are examples. So the best way I could find of providing examples was to find people who, in some way or another, were exhibiting some of the behaviours that I associated with a learning architect. I didn't want those all to be people who are fortunate enough to be looking at the big picture across some giant corporation, but also people who are working in smaller organisations, or people who are just responsible for one area of an organisation. And I also wanted to make sure that we represented people from public and private sector organisations, but also from different parts of the world. So I hunted around to try and find people that I thought could represent that cross-section, and I believe that I accomplished that, although, quite honestly, you can't have enough examples, and if we had another 10, 20, I'd be delighted.
Lovely. So how could these case studies help those who are hoping to become learning architects?
Well, I hope that readers will be able to identify with at least a selection of those case studies and say, well, that's a little bit like the sort of job I have, or the sort of responsibilities I have. Therefore, maybe it really is possible for me to behave in a more strategic, architectural way, if you like, rather than just doing what we've always done. So it's as simple as that, really. Is to provide models for people that they can identify with, and as I say, that's why I wanted to make sure that they were as wide-ranging as possible.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Clive, for your time. And I'm just wondering, just before we leave, what further advice you might have for everyone out there.
Well, I think that my final thought would be that it is not to be too discouraged by the gap that there might be between what you do now and what might be suggested in the book as the behaviour of a new learning architect in a new century, and in a very different environment to one we've experienced before. Not to be discouraged by the gap, but to be chipping away at that gap, and to be doing what you can within the constraints of your particular job description and the culture of the organisation you work within. But you can make a difference in small ways, and you can develop confidence, which ultimately will allow you to take on much greater challenges and to make much bigger differences in the future. So it's a long journey, but you've got to have a vision for where you want to get to, and to take small steps towards it.